Okay, so welcome again to the Bird Art Museum, everyone, and we're going to continue on with our next speaker. Thank you so much for our first conversation, and I think we left off at a good place to continue with Lucas Livingston, who is visiting us from the Art Institute of Chicago. He's going to talk some about the techniques that the Art Institute is using to expand accessibility within the museum. Lucas Livingston directs the Art Institute's educational opportunities and wellness programs for lifelong learners and people with disabilities. This includes initiatives that serve individuals with blindness and low vision, the deaf community, as well as people who are hard of hearing, people living with Alzheimer's disease and dementia. He frequently leads workshops and conference sessions about art enrichment, accessibility, and educational technology, and he co-chairs the Art Institute's Accessibility Working Group. So he is going to talk to us and also has brought some things to share with us that the Art Institute uses. So Lucas, thank you so much for joining us, and the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thanks for inviting me to come and speak, and for y'all coming out to listen. This is great. I'm really excited. It's always a pleasure to share what we're doing at the Art Institute of Chicago. Not that necessarily we're a model for best practices, but there's, I always say there's you're never doing it right. There's always the room for improvement, and it's a constant trajectory of learning as well for myself. So yeah, it's a real pleasure and tough act to follow too, though. Pleasure to share with you a few of the services we offer and the resources that we've produced, and something I'm always emphasizing is what we might have touched on a little bit earlier, is that, anytime you produce a resource or you offer a service that some members of your staff might say, well, this is for such a small percentage of your population, invariably it ends up being very profoundly beneficial to all of your museum visitors. I mean, one popular phrase, you can call it the curb cut effect. You put a curb cut in a sidewalk and you find 90% of the traffic flow, pedestrian traffic's using that for strollers, for carts, for all sorts of things that you didn't realize. So likewise, with touchable resources and even with just gallery labels that emphasize, surprisingly, talking about the works of art. There's an interesting thing. So it's profoundly helpful for all museum visitors. So the title here of my PowerPoint, 3D Printing and Multisensory Engagement in an Art Museum. I'm going to talk a lot more about beyond 3D printing, but that's been a recent push. Everybody's interested in 3D printing these days. Maybe some of you are sick and tired of 3D printing by now, but we'll talk a little bit about that. In the background, and I'm already violating one of my personal best practices here, is say never put text on top of an image, because people with low vision have a real hard time maybe discerning text when it's superimposed on top of an image. So I'm breaking my own rule here, apologies. But in the background we have a close-up photograph of a handful of 3D printed models sitting on a table, and then the title and my name's in front of that. A few of the programs we've been offering historically at the Art Institute of Chicago, one that we've been doing for 20 some odd years before I started working there. I've not been there that long. I've been there about 15 years, so I'm definitely now on the cusp of being one of the old timers there. But Tours with Sighted Guides is a service we're pleased to offer, where specially trained volunteers will provide descriptions of the works of art in the permanent collections and exhibitions, being trained on how to talk about a work of art, how to describe that. And I always say it's not rocket science, but at the same time, it's not something to take for granted. We do take our sight for granted, and so it's something that it's helpful to learn how to look at and how to then describe a work of art. So going through those training sessions, a couple images on screen here of our Tours of Sighted Guides programs in process, where volunteers are leading visitors through our recent exhibition that we had on Paul Gauguin. Another feature resource that we've had for, about, I think since the year 2000 here is the Elizabeth Morse Touch Gallery. So we have a permanent dedicated display that visitors are welcome to touch. And pictured on screen, we have 4 sculpture busts and a close-up of one of the sculpture busts made of bronze. So the 4 different busts of different materials: bronze, marble, granite, and they're all original works of art, accessioned pieces in the Art Institute's collection, not replicas. So that was in one sense, that was a critical decision that we wanted to make, to put original works out instead of replicas, in a sense to, well, for ourselves, we wanted to make a validated, permanent museum exhibition, and certainly one can have replicas as a teaching collection and such, but there's a, within the museum world, there's a certain level of maybe additional value and respect that's placed upon this exhibition that involves permanent, original works of art. And accompanying the sculptures, we include braille labels as well as large print text. And then I mischievously say, well, why is that got to be the large print text? Why is that not the standard font size in the museum? Why is that the exception? So I know I'm going to get in trouble, but and then also a variety of different materials that people are welcome to explore through touch. And what's great is it's right next to our education center, the Ryan Learning Center, and it's actually outside of the ticketed perimeter of the galleries of the museum. So anybody's welcome to come on in and get their hands on for learning. It's really popular with the kids as they come and go from the education center. The docents will include that on their school tours. Notably, the docents say we strategically choose to include it at the end of the tour rather than at the beginning of the tour. So rather than setting up the expectation that they can get their hands on everything, there's a very limited number of works of art throughout the galleries that visitors are actually welcome to touch. And on occasion, once a month actually, for one of our regular daily public gallery talks, I provide a public verbal description talk, and then also, in as much as we're able to, I'll also strategically try to include works of art that we're able to touch, or sometimes including some of the tactile resources, tactile replicas that we've produced. One of those resources, I think we debuted these in 2006 in Chicago. We had a festival of Chicago disability arts and culture called Bodies of Work. It's still an ongoing consortium, but these tactiles, we call them, and they're just that, they're tactile tablets, roughly 8 by 10 plastic tablets, where we have reproduced paintings as 3-dimensional tactile relief carvings. So 5 different works of art from the museum's collection, including modern paintings, Impressionism, Dutch genre painting, a Aztec relief carving. That's the interesting exception, where the original is actually a relief carving. So in that sense, you could say the tactile of the Aztec coronation stone, as it's called, is more of a replica rather than an interpretation. So that's the thing, is when we're creating a raised line drawing or a tactile analog to a 2-dimensional surface, then it's very much an interpretation. The designer, and we work together with a professor of design at the School of the Art Institute, Helen Maria Nugent, to produce these tactiles. The designer has to decide, well, what do we want to include, what do we want to exclude? In one sense, one first thing that's excluded is any communication about the color. of the work of art because it's a strictly tactile surface. Other individuals have explored ways to convey color through touch. And these tactiles don't do that. Also, do we want to produce the subject matter of the painting, or do we want to produce the texture of the strokes of brush? And you think of Vincent van Gogh painting with the thick, heavy daubs of oil on canvas. And gosh, who doesn't want to brush their hands upon a Vincent van Gogh? I didn't say that, okay? But so this is another choice that we make in consultation with focus groups and our own community who are taking advantage of these resources. Also accompanying this kit, and I have all 5 of those tablets on the table up here. You're welcome to come up, and I do encourage you to make this table messy afterwards, heavily through our explorations, but accompanying the tablets, which include also Braille labels on the same tablet. We also have the catalog entries effectively reproduced as Braille sheets, as well as laminated photographs of the works of art with large print text on the back of them. Because about, 90% or so of our visitors and members who would take advantage and request to interact with these resources might have low vision, rather than being wholly blind. And so in that sense, while it's tricky perhaps to take in a large painting hanging on a wall, if one can hold the photograph close up to one's eyes, then some details might be able to be discerned. And people have expressed repeatedly how much they appreciate having that. Another program, as was briefly mentioned in the introduction, was Art in the Moment. This is our program serving people who are living with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. And so we offer basically using the museum as and the works of art as a resource for socialization, for interaction, for exploration and expression. One thing with Alzheimer's and dementia, from the point of your diagnosis onward, you're almost culturally, we systematically remove rights and privileges and dignity from individuals. You don't have a choice if you can drive a car anymore, or what medications you take, or even when you're going to bathe yourself. So creating an environment where we welcome the socialization, and we encourage individuals to provide their own interpretations, what they want to say about the works that they're looking at. So that creates this validating space where, yes, your voice still matters. Also, the program is just as much for their care partners as it is for the individuals with the diagnosis, because creating this socially neutral, non-clinical environment where they come to the museum as peers is again creating this very socially validating experience. So on screen here we have a couple images of the tour group going through the galleries in front of a giant fallen tree. What looks like this is Charles Ray's sculpture called hinoki, which is the Japanese word for cypress. And then adjacent to that is a photograph of the group sitting at tables in one of our studios, where we follow up the thematic discussions in the galleries with a hands-on art making experience that's facilitated by a professional art therapist. So in that sense, this experience has therapeutic value on multiple levels. We even created an exhibition of the works of art produced by the participants in our program shortly after we began the program a few years back, so that they can see their works of art hanging in an art museum. Again, it's about creating this very socially validating experience for them. And to have a little bit of a personal plug here, not that I have a book to promote, but I have at least a journal article to promote here in the Journal of Museum Education. Co-authored an article just talking about our program for people with Alzheimer's and the therapeutic wellness benefits of this experience, and also going in depth into describing, since it's the Journal of Museum Education, a lot of art museum individuals are reading this journal, and so the collaborative efforts between the Art Institute, CJE Senior Life, who's a Chicago elder care organization, and then the art therapist. So how we produced this very heavily collaborative experience. So moving on now to the 3D printing, a few years back in 2014, we received a grant from the IMLS, that's the Institute for Museum and Library Services, a grant to explore the efficacy of 3D printed objects in an art museum context in various different levels across the museum, with different audiences, not always with 3D printed objects, but also with the practice of 3D scanning itself, or 3D modeling on the computer. So, and asking this, the fundamental question we asked is, on screen the quote here, can cutting edge technology such as 3D printing be used to encourage a deeper, more meaningful engagement with museum collections? So, as I said, we worked across the museum with this 3D project, working with our curatorial departments, working with a variety of audiences, working with our the School of the Art Institute as well. Four images on screen here, close-up details of a few of the 3D printed objects that we produced, one of which we have on the table here. It's one of my favorites. It's an ancient Greek drinking cup in the shape of a sheep head. So, and then a close-up of some young kids peering into, I think it looks like maybe a MakerBot 3D printer, looking at the process of 3D generation. So it was a very learning experience as well. And then at left is a photo of one of our technicians who is working on the computer in front of that giant fallen cypress tree in the galleries, and there's a fragment that is actually removable only by very carefully trained individuals, or by accident sometimes, but a fragment that is then was being scanned in detail. So, and I think the process is as interesting, and the technology for many of our participants in the programs, and for our staff too, is as interesting as it is as the final outcome as well. So I'm certainly happy to talk more about the process afterwards. So the different, on screen, just a bulleted list of the different programs that we produced involving this 3D printing project. So working with families, a family festival where we had an activity called Pose Like a Statue, where people themselves could be scanned and modeled on screen. You sit on basically a giant lazy Susan, and they'd spin you around taking a scan. So that was fun. And then for adult audiences, something called HandsOn, and I'll talk a lot more about that in a moment. Working together with After Schools Matters, a teen partnership program. There was a teen lab where teens would model items on the computer. For tweens as well, we did something called Objects, remixed and reconfigured. And then also separately a final program involving educators, so teachers, called Cutting Edge 3D Printing and Arts Education. The only one I'm confidently able to address here is the one we did for adults, which is the one I spearheaded. So, but I'm very happy to connect you with anybody who, if anybody's interested, with the folks at the museum who spearheaded the other programs. And yeah, and it was a effort across the museum, as I said, a few photos on screen of the different collaborators within the museum. We had multiple sessions where we got together to learn ourselves all about the process and the technology, and bringing in outside speakers and through video conferencing or in person to help inform us as we worked our way through this. The HandsOn program, the subtitle, Multisensory Tours for People with Alzheimer's and People with Blindness and Low Vision. It's a little bit of a mouthful. But it was a profoundly rewarding experience for myself too, as we worked with these 3D printed objects. So the point behind the hands-on experience for adults was taking two of our already existing programs that I already addressed, the Tours with Sighted Guides and the Art in the Moment program for people with Alzheimer's and dementia, and then infusing 3D printed objects into that to see, asking that fundamental question we had at the beginning is if cutting-edge tech like 3D printing can produce this more meaningful, enriching experience with objects in an art museum. And I was a little skeptical at first for a number of reasons. You know, oh, is 3D printing just this little fad? Is there going to be a problem, this disconnect between these original works and then these plastic replicas? How are people going to react to that? So, but I was rather overwhelmed by the response from our test subjects. So the two audiences. And I think, and then we had a focus group afterwards. And you know, I swear we must have accidentally conscripted a bunch of poets to be on our focus group, because they had these most moving statements, quotes on screen. Touching wakes something up inside of you. The object becomes the object becomes a part of you. It becomes a friend. And the replica is our way of getting through the glass. That became kind of our motto, getting through the glass. So that was a fun one. A few pictures on screen from the gallery activities of our Tours with Sighted Guides programs. Sitting in the galleries and standing, holding these 3D printed objects. One woman is holding the sheep cup up to her mouth as though pantomiming like she's drinking from it. And so the fun playfulness of a lot of these objects is you almost seem to don a mask as you're drinking from these cups. So that was a fun joke in classical antiquity. By personal academic training, I'm a classical art historian, so I certainly, the fact that I was spearheading this project might have slightly influenced the fact that we largely reproduced classical objects, but at the same time, there are a number of factors that went into choosing which works of art and so on. One, it was of paramount importance that I thought we should try to choose works that we could reproduce on a 1-to-1 scale. So life size, and then also intentionally choosing works that were originally meant to be touched in some manner. So drinking cups, musical instruments, little effigy figurines, objects that were designed by their original creators to be touched. And so this always reminds me of some Japanese figures we have up on the table here, little palm-sized objects that, let me just grab one. That's a phenomenal idea. Let's totally holding one figurine here that it always reminds me of something our curator of Japanese art once said, is that it just feels right in your hand when she was palming it in close examination. So the idea that perhaps the artists who produced these works of art that were meant to be touched might have infused a sense of physical aesthetics in the original works of art. So, and maybe that might come across to the audience as we're exploring these programs. The other advantage is that the one Georgina's holding there is that you can actually notice on the back there's a bit of a design on the back side. And this is one example of this curb cut effect. These works are installed in the galleries behind glass, thrust up against a wall, where the back is invisible. Having the 3D replica allows you to explore it from all angles, and you might even begin to learn new things about it. I myself looked at these works of art for years in the galleries, and only when I get them in my hands, the 3D replicas, did I begin to notice some features that I just never consciously observed before. I'll just skip that slide. Then also, on the tours that we designed, just bringing in this full multisensory experience, because people are multimodal learners. Some individuals learn better through sight, some through touch, others through sound, through hearing, others just through experiencing firsthand and doing versus like traditional classroom learning. So nobody fits nicely into a single bucket. So incorporating multisensory strategies beyond sight and touch into the tour as well, we brought sound into the experience. So with musical instruments, the one exception to the 3D printing was a Chinese bell that we reproduced actually in bronze, and it's not, in that sense, it was not a scan and a replica, but more of an homage or an interpretation in that sense, where, interestingly, actually, one of my own volunteers took a bronze casting class and was inspired by our mammoth Chinese bronze suspension bells in the museum, and decided to produce a much scaled down bronze homage to these bells, and then gifted us with one of these bronze bells so that we could use that on our touch tours. And so we included that as kind of the wild card to throw off our entire scientific study. And then invited everyone to strike it. So these bells don't have clappers. You strike it with a mallet. In that sense, then, being very participatory, where everyone becomes a musician during the experience. And people then commented afterwards how with the bronze bell, or on the next slide I'll show a little whistle, how the music, the sound, really helped them to understand the object more than just the touch alone, or the sight for when we offered the program for our individuals with Alzheimer's. And I have a video clip here that I'll briefly play a few seconds of, which I just downloaded this from YouTube, but it's a performance of a traditional Chinese bells, a large replica set, a large assemblage of suspension bells, and it actually takes 3 people to play this big suspension bell set. Bells of different sizes to produce a full, like a xylophone scale of tones. So I'll play this snippet here. I'm going to skip ahead to the good part. I think that starts around 33 seconds. So we played this on an iPad during the tours in the galleries while people were passing the bell around. Then also is perhaps the most diminutive object that we have, which is handing around there, and is a small 13th century Colombian whistle, a ceramic whistle, with a lizard-like creature, perhaps an iguana, perched on top of it. The conventional term for this is an ocarina, a little handheld whistle that you blow through. And so this was an object also reproduced at the life-size scale, and it's really a small, very small trinket. We actually started off with 5 of these, and we're down to 1. And talking about people palming it and then walking off. So I do hope I'll get back all of my 3D prints after this. But so, but the advantage is once you have the computer file, you can easily just click print again. I think it costs about $4 or so to reproduce this iguana whistle. That doesn't give you license to take it, but and then some of the larger prints might cost around $60 or so. So they're not trivial, but at the same time, they're certainly very it's potentially very, very likely to be able to reproduce them. Interestingly, also talking about this this disconnect between the plastic replica and the original work of art. So not only the texture and the material, but also the weight. So these plastic drinking cups don't have the same heft as the original ceramic object. But with the iguana whistle, that Georgina has there, we were able to we weighed the original and then calculated how much plastic infill we would need to use in the 3D model. So this is actually scale weight of the original work of art. So that's how much that one weighs. So, and then also I have a audio snippet here of what a comparable modern ocarina would sound like, and not the one that we have passing around here, but. So that's a little bit of a larger scale whistle. It has a deeper resonance. So the original would have been more, perhaps a higher pitched sound. Some of the key findings we had through this study here on screen here. So getting through the glass, in quotes, is powerful and it's possible. Getting hands-on helps generate discussion about art, and it provokes dynamic interpretation. And the multisensory approach promotes accessibility for multimodal learners, which really includes all museum visitors in that sense. And the relevance extends beyond the targeted audience and the programs, and that always reminds me, these items, we produce them for this study, but they have this permanent longevity now, and we continue to utilize them on museum programs, not just for our touch tours, and not just for the programs for people with dementia, but for our just general public tours. As soon as the docents learned that, Lucas has this box of 3D prints, they borrow them because school kids, who doesn't want to get their hands on 3D printed objects? So, and I think it's helpful for all audiences as well, because then you can manipulate the objects, you can rotate them, see it from all angles as well, and sometimes we learn better through touch in some instances than through sight alone. Also, as I mentioned, the audience was as interested in the technology as they are in the artwork. That was, in hindsight, it's obvious, but it wasn't really something we had fully anticipated. Half of our time in the program these tours was spent just talking about 3D printing in general, so that was interesting. We have a bar graph on here showing some metrics. I just tossed that in to validate the scientific approach. But exploring the evidence of engagement. So measuring the 5 different experiences for teens, families, kids, teachers, and the program for adults is kind of off the chart. Just how the hands-on with the 3D prints. Very much enhanced, you could say, the personal connection with the objects that we were discussing in the galleries. A lot of text on screen. There's just a couple little passages I want to pull out here. So most significant were the comments about the multisensory inputs, about how the ability to see and touch and hear, or in the case of the tours for guests with visual, this is from our study, to touch and hear. The objects magnified the tour experience and generated the observed focus. This multi-page summary of the study that we had is available through a blog that we produced in conjunction with this study called the URL museum3d.arctic.edu. That's in the footer. museum3d.arctic.edu. A couple great quotes, again, employing the poetry of our focus group. I liked the fact that we could have the representations in our hands and feel the detail and size. It was better than having someone describe it. So in that sense, one tremendous benefit of having these tactile resources is then that empowers the museum visitors to offer their own interpretation of the work of art instead of, as the quote here says, relying on some third party to describe what it looks like. So, and then when something's, as the quote here says, when something's described, you're taking someone else's impression or perspective. And if you give me the delicious pastry, as someone says here, then I can make my own decisions about what it is. More bar graphs, yeah, very scientific. I'm skipping past that. Sorry. Oh, okay, it's actually, I can see the text better on screen, on the big screen here. So the strongest evidence of the one-to-one relationship development came from the adults on the guided tours, and the response is likely attributed to the self-described emotional experience, the awakening created by the multisensory inputs. So a couple quotes from our tour participants: the object becomes a part of you. It becomes a friend, much more intimate. Touching awakens my imagination. I could see it better. I could see it better, but in a different way. Touching made up for lack of vision. It was a very emotional experience. So these are very personal reactions. I wouldn't say that this is objective data necessarily, but they're great anecdotes that come out of the focus group. So then, let me see, I think maybe I have time to, I'll just quickly read the one quote down there. I can relate to it better. I may want to go back and look it up and get insight. So that's of course the golden nugget that every museum wants to hear, is that this will contribute to return visits, renewing your membership, leaving us in your will, things like that. You know, this is what development always is looking to hear. So, you know, maybe a quote here. Maybe I'm not an artist or artistically inclined, but touching a piece wakes something up inside of you. And then I have that delicious pastry quote again. You know, if you give me the delicious pastry, then I can make my own decision about what it is. That's always a fun thing. And then, you know, another anecdote that I don't think I have that quote on hand, but talking about this concern I had about what will they think if they have this mere replica rather than an original object that they're permitted to touch. And one woman, she said afterwards, she says, I can't believe that I touched an actual replica of a 2,000-year-old bronze bell. You know, that was great, an actual replica. So, after this project that motivated me to consider other ways we could try to help make works of art accessible through touch, especially two-dimensional surfaces. The tactiles that we have here are one good example, but then I thought also about, well, one of the great strengths of the Art Institute's collection is Japanese woodblock prints. Perhaps second only to our French Impressionist collection, we have this exceptionally strong Japanese print collection. And I'm often giving tours in the Japanese print galleries, and a lot of people then want to know about the process of woodblock print making, and it's a complicated process, and so I might show some pictures and try to describe it, but again, a lot of people respond and learn better through getting their hands on something, being able to get their hands on the tools, on the actual block of wood, because the idea of pulling a print from a block of wood, some people, it doesn't really translate well. And if they can see, or if they can touch, okay, you're saying this carved surface and you put ink on it. I get it now, Lucas. Okay, and so for years I've been showing pictures of a wood block in our collection. On screen are a few different pictures of a wood block in the bottom left corner is a carved 1858 original Japanese block carved by Utagawa Hiroshige. You know, we're in the Midwest, we can call him Hiroshige, but Hiroshige. And at top left is a final print from this block, a multicolor print of a large swooping landscape, a mountainous, hilly mountainous landscape. We're high up in the hills looking down over a bay with water receding into the skyline. There appears to be a structure in the upper left corner, maybe a temple or a fun viewing point as well over this lovely rolling landscape. And there's people in the bottom foreground hiking up a steep mountain path leading up to this structure in the upper left corner. And so then, interestingly though, the Art Institute does not have this print in our collection. This is from the MFA. We have the original block that produced this print, but we don't actually have a print from this block. So, but anyway, then I thought, well, instead of showing pictures of this block, just to get it more visceral, what if I could make a 3D replica of the block? And then I was in consultation with our Advanced Output Center at the School of the Art Institute. They said, you know, instead of a plastic 3D print, why don't you use laser engraving? That might work better for the method of reproducing this block. And then you could actually take an original artist's grade wood block and laser engrave into that. So it's then the same process of removing, of excising, instead of 3D printing, which is an additive process, building up. So that would translate better to the artist's practice as well. So in the bottom right corner, I have a test print of that laser engraved wood block, a detail. And then in the upper right, I have actually a short video clip I'll show of the laser engraving process. It's a detail zoomed in video showing a printer head moving back and forth rapidly over a block of wood as it's burning and etching its way into the block of wood. And there's some audio, but the audio is really not significant, but at least we'll hear the sound of the printer head moving back and forth. So rapidly moving. We're just chit-chatting while we're watching it. So it was a short clip, but just gives you a sense of the speed at which. It took about 45 minutes, as they said, to carve the whole block. And I have that whole block up here. So we have this laser engraved block I'm happy to pass around. And then, I'll hand that off. Then we thought, well, gosh, couldn't we then maybe have an exhibition around the whole process of producing woodblock prints? And this is another indicative example of how you create this one item that you think might be for one specific purpose, but then it goes on to have a far greater relevancy. And we had an entire exhibition. Our curator of Japanese prints put together a whole exhibition around the making of a woodblock print, and used this replica in the exhibition adjacent to the original. And so when she asked, "Hey Lucas, can I borrow your laser engraved replica for the exhibition?" I said, "Absolutely, as long as in the installation you let people touch it." And she said, "Oh, that's a great idea." So, so we installed it, framed nicely on the wall, and there's some photos of the installation here. The original behind glass next to the replica that visitors were welcome to come up and touch. And then one of our print conservators actually pulled prints from the replica block just as an experiment. Is this a new method that print artists can use to create their woodblock prints now through laser engraving and then pulling prints from that rather than hands-on carving with the tools? And maybe something that not all artists would like to do, but it's a possibility. And I've gotten some inquiries from artists about this, the laser engraving process. So here's an actual print that we pulled from the replica block, and it's just the basic line drawing, so it would have taken a good dozen or more blocks to produce the full color print, separate blocks for each individual color. So all we have is the key block that produces the bold dark outline. The other blocks might all just be lost. That's the tragic fate of so many Japanese woodblocks, is they're lost to time. So, but then also this helps with getting a sense of the quality of the paper that's utilized. So I'm certainly happy to pass this around. There's a slight semblance of a bit of a texture of the raised surface of the ink on the paper, but it's not particularly pronounced though. So a final comment that came, I think, from a participant in the teacher educator workshop is a quote on screen here. There's nothing like standing in front of the original art, but the copies make it possible for people who can't see the original, and sometimes the relationship with the copy can be better than with the original. Maybe, that's food for thought. In that sense, I think, well, a lot of people were able to get their hands on in the exhibition and maybe wrap one's brains around artists' process a little better through these multimodal approaches to engagement and learning. So increasingly in recent years, I'm starting to see more and more a lot of hands-on interactivity in museums, including sometimes in art museums too. So that's a very welcome feature. Institutions that are traditionally very hands-off, very emphasizing a visual approach to the experience and learning, but increasingly we're starting to see maybe that tide is turning. Maybe it's a sine curve, it might bounce back, who knows, but it's a very interesting climate right now though. So thank you very much. Please I invite you, please come up and explore some more of the tactiles and such that we have on the table here. And I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has any questions and keep the conversation going. So thanks a lot. All right. Great. Any comments, questions? Disagreements? Yeah, I welcome it all.
Nice presentation. Thanks for sharing. Hey, what do you think about this 3D printing as the future of museum outreach? Does it seem like in the future we're going to have 3D printers at home and we can get a little taste of the museum from a remote? Or is that a threat to museums? Or is that a way of connecting with people who wouldn't otherwise come into your facility?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Gosh, yeah, I think, well, the technology is very rapidly changing too. And what was originally exceedingly and prohibitively expensive is now at a very consumer level. So, and I think somebody, I'm stealing this from some uncited source, but somebody once told me, you remember those original printers where it was dot matrix and you had to tear off the perforated edges as it spooled out of the printer? And now you can think of these incredible photorealistic laser printers that we have these days. So 3D printing is in that dot matrix infancy right now. Down the road, it's 5, 10, 20 years, we're going to be able to, and already today at a more industrial scale, we're able to 3D print in varieties of different materials: ceramic, glass, stone. Hershey's is 3D printing with chocolate. Hey. So, and multicolors too. You can already do that to some extent with multicolored plastic filament. Or I've even seen a tricky thing. There's an instructor at the School of the Art Institute, Tom Burtonwood, who was an artist in residence at the museum for a couple of years back. Actually, during this 3D project we had, and one of his mediums is 3D printing. And as he's printing with white plastic filament, he would even just hold a marker up to the spool of filament, and so that would color the filament as it goes through the printer, thereby producing a colored output. And you can change the marker at different times to change the color of the output. So creative ways, and that gets into the whole artist's process. So 3D making is a form of artistic production. Do museums feel threatened? You know, if you can create even a nearly indistinguishable replica. I'm sure some people are scared about that, but you know, with all technologies, you can use it either for good or for evil. So I'm not too worried. But then also the idea, are people then going to have the excuse not to come to a museum if they have if they can just produce it at home? Well, you know, we have catalogs and websites that people can go to have the museum experience at home, but does that really replicate the museum experience? No, I mean, it definitely does not. In fact, it might entice them more to come to the museum. And this is something I always emphasize when we're offering our tours with the tactiles and the 3D printed objects. Yeah, we could sit in our educator resource center on the comfortable chairs and just pass them around and discuss them there, but no, we don't. We pound the pavement through the galleries going to the works of art, because as the quote here says, there's nothing like standing in front of the original work of art. You know, and even if one cannot take in that experience visually, the museum visit is a multisensory activity, and it's a social activity in as much as it's a physical activity. So some people come to the museum alone, a lot of people come with friends, some people come for learning, others come for more of a spiritual experience too, a meditative experience. And so just it's about the destination and the whole experience beyond just the visual input. Yeah. Long-winded response to your great question.
I was fascinated by the fact that you had the in the scientific work, but about how you were thinking about dwell time and the amount of time that's spent with an artwork in terms of bar graphs. And it seems like a lot of museums have been moving towards eye tracking, right, as a model for this. You know, a lot of people have actually been able to use, you know, things like MoMA, where you can actually sort of look at someone and you start to see the artwork as it unfolds right before them. But it seemed like what you were doing is actually moving us in a very exciting way away from, right, purely visual dwell time, right, and engagement. It seems to be moving like your measure of attention to art away from just the visual and into a larger sort of idea about multisensory engagement. Would you say that's true generally, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to generalize, I think. So certainly, though, trying to explore different avenues for engagement, and it's not, again, it's not just about traditional learning. Not everybody wants to come to a museum for learning. So, and in a sense, I think one thing that we're so often trying to emphasize is through various strategies, and it can just be Q&A, it can be asking these broad open-ended discussion-based questions, it can be through hands-on learning or hands-on engagement, but empowering the traditional visitor to be as much the interpreter as the traditional authority. So in a sense, it's everyone's museum then, and breaking down the hierarchy of a traditional approach. Yeah. So I don't know. I'm skirting around your question a little bit there, but yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm really glad to know what the Art Institute is doing, and programs that are, seem to be groundbreaking in the museum world. And one of the things that really struck me, and which I'm going to quote elsewhere, is this process where you make the wood block, that you laser engrave the wood block, and it's originally for a specific audience, and then it becomes part of a display for everybody, and that it becomes a tactile display for everybody, but also that the process is then suggestive to artists. So it's a way in which the museum is contributing to the creation of art in addition to the preservation and appreciation of art. So that's very exciting, and it's sort of exciting to think about maybe other occasions where that might happen. I was thinking when you were talking about the programming for people with dementia and Alzheimer's, and I was wondering, and I realized that this work is not in the collection of the Art Institute, but anyway, I was wondering if there's an occasion to show those visitors' work, the late work of Willem de Kooning, which is sometimes he was identified, it's murky whether the diagnosis was dementia or Alzheimer's or whatever. And when that work exhibited just after his death, I believe, at Museum of Modern Art in New York, there was a certain amount of controversy because people were saying, well, is it really his work, or was it that he aided and assisted by others? So there were those types of questions, and but also there were many questions about, do we want to identify this as the work of somebody with dementia or Alzheimer's and so on and so forth. But I'm wondering, I'm just sort of intrigued by the possibility that people in a group visiting the art in this context, if they would respond to work by a professional artist who shares the diagnosis.
No, it's interesting. I hadn't really even thought much about that in particular. There have been other exhibitions as well of artists who kind of traced their own trajectory once upon receiving a diagnosis. I think also Untermolen was another one who, and that he had an exhibition at the Chicago Cultural Center a few years back, and it's pretty interesting. No, we haven't done much with that. In a sense, there's a school of thought when offering programming for people with dementias that you don't want to bring up the diagnosis in conversations. But it's a fact of life too, and at the same time, while we're not bringing it up, the participants are bringing it up too, and because they're living with it day in, day out, and so there's even some self-deprecation involved in the experience too. It's humbling, but it's also exceptionally rewarding too. It's very fascinating. I haven't really given much thought to that interesting question. To what extent, how much should the works by de Kooning be considered his works later in life? But I'll leave that to the theorists and scholars to discuss.
Any other questions? So I think that wraps up our program for the morning portion. We hope you can all come back and join us this evening for the exhibition, where you will see more of the writing samples that were written by students and selected by students, as well as the collaborative artwork made in response to that. And we hope people will really engage with that, touch that, experience that. Thank you so much to both of our speakers. And Natalie, I don't know if you have any last words. I think it's time for all of us to enjoy lunch and think a lot about all the things we've heard today. The museum was really excited to host this and work with students in the different departments, and we look forward to this evening.